The lantern trembled in his hand, throwing long, jagged shadows across the walls of the small cabin. He froze, breath hitching, when a soft, ragged sob cut through the stillness. "I'm not clean anymore," the voice whispered. It was fragile, raw, and yet carried a weight that made Daniel Morrow's gut twist like a rope. He stepped forward, cautious, eyes straining through the dim glow. On the cot, a woman huddled beneath a tattered blanket, hands pressed to her face. Her body shook, not from cold, but from some terror he couldn't name yet. He had seen fear before, rustlers, wolves, fire, but this was different. It wrapped around the room like smoke, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Who did this to you?" he asked, voice low, almost breaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she buried deeper under the cloth, and when he dared to lift it, the sight made him step back instinctively. Her arms were smeared with dried blood and ash, her dress torn, dirt pressed into the fabric in jagged streaks, and across her back, just visible where the blanket had slipped, a mark, raw and seared into her skin, made Daniel stagger. Not because he had seen something like it before, but because he had thought he had buried it long ago. The wind rattled the window panes, a low keening that seemed almost mournful, and Daniel's ears caught the faintest scuff, bare feet moving hesitantly across the floor behind him. He spun, gun already halfway out of its holster, but there was nothing there, only silence, thick and hungry. His mind raced. Who was she? What had brought her here, to his quiet cabin miles from the nearest town? The neighbors trusted him. The law had left him alone, and yet this woman, this broken soul, was a mystery he could not yet untangle. Her eyes met his briefly, wide and pleading, then darted to the floor again. The weight of her gaze, even in that fleeting moment, told him his story he wasn't ready to hear. A sudden rap at the door, sharp, deliberate, made his pulse leap. Not a soft knock, but something that demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement. Daniel froze, the lantern swaying in his hand, casting light over the woman's huddled form. She whispered again, almost too softly to hear. "They're coming. They'll know I'm here." He swallowed hard, feeling the knot in his chest tighten. Outside, the night pressed close, full of whispers and shadows. Inside, the woman trembled, holding on to the last shred of whatever dignity she had left. And Daniel knew he could not turn away, not now, not when the truth he thought buried had clawed its way back into the light. And then, the sound of hooves, distant at first, then growing louder, pounding the frozen earth, coming closer, carrying someone or something toward his cabin. Daniel's hand hovered over the door latch, every muscle taut as if the wood itself might betray him. Outside, the hoofbeats thudded against the frozen ground, a rhythm that set his teeth on edge. He glanced at her, pale, shaking, eyes wide with silent pleading. The instinct to shut the door, to hide and wait for the riders to pass, warred with something deeper, the gnawing knowledge that turning her away would be a death sentence. "Who are they?" he asked, voice low, cautious. She shook her head, pressing herself tighter to the blanket. "You don't understand. They can't know I'm here." Her words came in fragments, like splintered glass. Daniel saw the fear behind them, fear not just of strangers, but of something personal, a shadow that had followed her long before she arrived at his doorstep. He weighed the choices like a scale in his mind, protect her and risk drawing the wrath of men who didn't forgive, men who rode hard and struck fast, or turn away and perhaps save himself, but at the cost of a life he couldn't bear to. See destroyed. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with the tension in the room. Every creak of the cabin floor, every gust through the cracked window felt like a warning. He heard it again, a soft scratch, like nails on the doorframe. Someone was trying to peer in. Daniel's fingers brushed the cold steel a tiny anchor against the storm of doubt. The woman flinched at the sound, her eyes brimming, lips trembling. "Please, don't let them find me," she whispered. The simplicity of the plea cut through his reasoning, stripped away his fear of consequence, leaving only the human truth. She needed him. Daniel's thoughts drifted to the neighbors, the sheriff, the small, fragile network of trust he'd built over the years. Would they see her as innocent, dangerous, worth protecting, or worth suspicion? The weight of moral decision pressed down, heavier than any saddle, than any bullet he'd ever faced. A knock, sharp, impatient, deliberate, sounded again, closer this time. Daniel's pulse spiked. The sound carried judgment in its echo. The woman's hand shot out, gripping his wrist, cold and clammy, pulling him toward her. "If you turn me away, they'll take everything from me," she said, voice breaking. Daniel took a breath, the choice clear in its impossibility. To hide her would be defiance. To leave her would be complicity. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "All right," he said, voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "You stay. I'll see this through." The lantern flickered again, and outside, the sound of hooves was joined by voices, low and threatening. Someone, or a dozen, was coming, and Daniel realized that this moral choice had just drawn a line in the snow. The first rider's shadow fell across the frost, long and black, and the door creaked under the pressure of inevitability. "They're close," Daniel muttered, moving toward the window, peering through the frost-streaked glass. The rider's silhouette grew sharper, mounted high on a dark horse. The glint of a rifle catching the last shimmer of lantern light. More shapes followed. Yet 3, then 4, figures cutting through the night like shadows stitched into the cold. The woman clutched the blanket tighter, pressing herself against the wall, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Daniel's fingers tightened around the Colt, knuckles white. Every instinct he had honed over years of isolation screamed caution, but the fear in her eyes anchored him, slowed the rush of panic that threatened to blind him. A voice called from outside, hoarse, carrying the weight of authority. "Daniel Morrow, open up, or we'll make it our business to tear it down." The syllables struck the cabin walls like gunfire. Daniel's heart skipped. These were not simple bounty hunters, nor wandering rustlers. This was the law, or something close enough to it, the kind of men who believed in their own justice more than any moral code. "Stay back," he whispered to the woman. Her eyes widened, but she nodded. Silent obedience mingled with fear. Daniel set the lantern on the table, letting its light catch the edges of the room, throwing long shadows that might confuse or intimidate. Then he stepped toward the door, gun drawn, ready for a confrontation he hadn't asked for. Outside, the men dismounted, boots crunching on the frost. The air smelled of smoke and leather, harsh and sharp. One of them, broad-shouldered, scar running across his cheek, approached, eyes flicking to the cabin's interior. "We know she's in there," the man said, voice cold, clipped. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Daniel's jaw tightened. He could hear the tension vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls. Every breath, every shift of weight, every drawn hand carried the unspoken promise of violence. The woman moved slightly, and Daniel's head snapped toward her, catching the glint of tears in her eyes. She whispered, almost inaudible, "They'll take me. They always do." A sudden crack, a branch underfoot or a misstep, broke the tense silence. The men froze, heads swiveling, guns rising, and Daniel felt his stomach knot. He realized the impossibility of what he had done. By sheltering her, he had invited danger into the very heart of his home. A harsh laugh rang out. Well, well, looks like we've got ourselves a little standoff." One of the men stepped closer, rifle ready. Daniel's eyes flicked to the woman, her small form trembling, fragile, desperate. And then a third sound. Another rider, approaching fast from the woods, their intentions unknown, carrying the potential to tip the balance into outright chaos. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, walls closing in, the air thick with sweat, fear, and smoke. Daniel knew the night had just begun, and by dawn, nothing would remain the same. The tension hung heavy, unbroken, until Daniel lowered the Colt just slightly, letting a fraction of the room's weight settle. The woman exhaled shakily, eyes still wide, and he offered the faintest gesture of reassurance. "Sit," he said, voice rough. She hesitated, then obeyed, curling onto the floor near the hearth. The flickering firelight kissed her face, revealing smudges of dirt and traces of tears, but also something fragile, the stubborn spark of survival. Daniel fetched a small tin of dried meat and a water flask from the cupboard, placing them near her. She stared at it, hesitation etched into every line of her body. You don't have to," she murmured, voice almost breaking. He shook his head. "You need it. You've been running too long." For a moment, silence wrapped the cabin around them, heavier than the gunmetal threat pressing at the door. Daniel watched her eat, careful, deliberate, each bite small and measured. He realized that in these quiet, simple gestures lay the only form of connection left in a world that had chewed her up and spat her out. His own throat felt tight. He had spent years alone, avoiding contact, avoiding responsibility. Yet now, sitting here, He understood the weight of holding someone's trust. She finally spoke, voice trembling but steadier than before. "I wasn't always like this," she said, glancing at the scar on her back, eyes full of unspoken shame. Daniel nodded, not needing explanation. The past had its marks. What mattered now was the fragile present. He extended a hand, hesitantly, offering a keepsake, a small, battered pocket watch he had carried for years. "It doesn't fix anything," he said softly, "but maybe it reminds you, someone sees you." She accepted it with shaking fingers, eyes brimming. The contact was brief, a spark of human warmth against the cold dread pressing from outside. Then came the sound that made both their hearts leap, a muted creak outside, a shift in shadow. The lawmen, or whoever sought her, hadn't gone. The micro-violence of presence, boots scraping gravel, the shuffle of fingers along rifle stocks, reminded them that the world outside still demanded vigilance. But for a few heartbeats, Daniel saw something different. A bond forming, fragile, delicate, yet unbroken. Mutual acknowledgement of survival, a wordless promise that neither would abandon the other. And just as that hope flickered, a distant shout carried through the night, followed by a heavier, relentless pounding. Horses, men, authority, and the cabin seemed to shrink again under the pressure. He gritted his teeth, hands brushing the colt once more, and met her gaze. "We keep each other alive," he said, low. She nodded. Outside, the unknown pressed closer, and the balance of hope and peril teetered violently. The door shuddered under a heavy push, splintering the silence into shards of dread. Daniel stood firm, gun leveled, eyes locked on the figures silhouetted by lanterns outside. The riders had circled, cutting off any escape, but he refused to yield. The woman pressed herself into the corner, clutching the pocket watch, trembling, yet alive. One of the men stepped forward, voice sharp, filled with accusation. "We know she's here, Morrow. Hand her over, or you'll answer for harboring what's wanted." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew what they meant. This wasn't just the law. It was vengeance masquerading as duty. "She's not your possession," he said, voice steady, carrying the weight of years spent surviving on principle. "And I'm not letting you take her." A tense pause followed, the kind that stretched seconds into eternities. Horses shifted outside, boots scraped gravel, and the wind carried the bitter scent of confrontation. Then, a decision was made. A sudden lunge from one of the men, rifle swinging. Daniel fired instinctively, the echo booming like a gunmetal heartbeat, and the man dropped, his weapon clattering across the frost. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders dove for cover, the cold night filled with shouted orders, the crack of gunfire, and the heavy, desperate breaths of those trapped inside the cabin. Daniel moved with careful precision, every shot calculated, every movement a dance of survival. Bisinim, she stayed low, the blanket wrapped tight around her, eyes wide but unwavering, as if her trust alone gave him the edge to keep them both alive. Minutes, or hours, it felt like minutes, passed in a blur of gunmetal and sweat. When the last shot rang out, silence fell like a heavy curtain. The remaining riders had fled, leaving the night to settle again over the frost-covered land. Daniel lowered the colt, feeling the tremor in his hands, chest heaving. She stepped forward cautiously, voice barely above a whisper. We're safe?" He shook his head slowly, exhaustion and relief colliding. "For now," he said. "But the world outside won't stop. It never does." She nodded, understanding more in that single quiet moment than words could convey. Daniel offered a hand, steady this time, and she took it, not as a plea, but as a partnership forged in fire and shadow. They sat together near the hearth, watching the first pale light of dawn creep over the horizon. Smoke from the fireplace curled like a promise of survival, fragile yet persistent. The mark on her back remained, a testament to the horrors endured, but now accompanied by something new. Safety, however fleeting, and the knowledge that someone had chosen to stand with her. Years later, she would remember that cabin, that night, and the quiet courage of a man who refused to turn away. The land stretched wide and indifferent beyond the walls, but inside, the warmth of human connection lingered. Daniel watched her for a long moment, then stepped outside, the frost crunching beneath his boots, and the morning sun caught the colt in his hand. He looked back at the cabin one last time. The blanket lay discarded, the fire sputtered low, and she stood tall in the doorway, eyes scanning the horizon. And in that moment, the world felt vast, cold, but theirs. The scene held, frozen, as if the land itself had paused to witness survival, defiance, and fragile hope. The camera would cut to black, leaving only the echo of a story carved into snow and shadow.